All right, ladies and gentlemen, now that you've taken your notes over words to the wiser, if you haven't taken them yet, you need to stop this ed puzzle right here. Go back to Google Classroom and take the notes, ladies and gentlemen. You will not do well on this ed puzzle if you do not take your notes first. I'm trying to help you out. So if you've already taken your notes, you're all good to go. We are going to practice identifying words of the wiser in our set of pages today. We'll read 39 through 50. I'll read specifically a few pages to you. I'll give you some pointers on how you could be interacting with the text using your strategies from the lesson today. And ladies and gentlemen, you'll be able to show me what you know. So by the end of this ed puzzle, you would have gone through 11 pages of the text, either with me or individually. You'll have some questions to answer, and you'll be demonstrating to me that you can A, go along with the text, go along with your notes, and keep demonstrating to me that you know how to write good sentences using the word strategy when it's being prompted and getting your points across. So ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. You're going to need your book. So with your notes, you learned all about words to the wiser. We all have been given examples of these throughout our lives, and we're getting ready to see how this shows up in the Glass Castle. So open up to page 39. I'll get it started with reading. I never believed in Santa Claus. None of us kids did. Mom and Dad refused to let us. They couldn't afford expensive presents, and they didn't want us to think that we weren't as good as other kids who, on Christmas morning, found all sorts of fancy toys under the tree that were supposedly left by Santa Claus. So they told us all about how other kids were deceived by their parents, how the toys that grown-ups claimed were made by little elves wearing bell caps in their workshop at the North Pole actually had labels on them saying, "Made in Japan." Try not to look down on other children, Mom said. It's not their fault that they've been brainwashed into believing silly myths. Let me read that one more time for you. Try not to look down on those other children, Mom said. It's not their fault they've been brainwashed into believing silly myths. Here, Rosemary is trying to help her daughter Jeanette not to feel so poorly about the things that she doesn't have because other people have them. Because she wanted her to understand that these kids may have these things, but not only are they materialistic, but ultimately they're given with deception behind it, because parents are misleading kids, making them believe that these toys are coming from little people working in workshops, when in all actuality, parents are going to the store, spending money on these toys, wrapping them up, and presenting them to the kids. So a couple of things that you might be able to take away from this example of words to the wiser is, first, lying is pointless, because ultimately the kids are going to be faced with the reality that Santa Claus is not real at some point. I hope that you knew before you watched this ed puzzle, because if not, sorry about that. But ultimately, she lets us know that lying is pointless. She also lets us know that deception can create more harm than good, because like I said, people are going to find out that Santa Claus isn't real, and why deceive people about it when you can just be honest? And then that last piece that we're going to take away from Rosemary, being honest and giving the harshest truth is always better than a sweet lie, okay? So think about what those three takeaways might help us learn more about Rosemary. What might she be really revealing about herself with saying something like that? And let's jump back into the text. We celebrated Christmas, but usually about a week after December 25th, when you can find perfectly good bows and wrapping paper that people had thrown away, and Christmas trees discarded on the roadside that still had most of their needles, and even some silver tinsel hanging on them. Mom and Dad would give us a bag of marbles or a doll or a slingshot that they had been marked down, way down, in an after Christmas sale. Dad lost his job at the gypsum mine, and after getting in an argument with the foreman, and when Christmas Eve came that year, we had no money at all. On Christmas Eve, Dad took each of his kids out into the desert night one by one. I had a blanket wrapped around me, and when it was my turn, I offered to share it with Dad, but he said no thanks. The cold never bothered him. I was 5 that year. I sat next to Dad and we looked up at the sky. Dad loved to talk about the stars. He explained to us how they had rotated through the night as the earth turned. He taught us to identify the constellations and how to navigate by the North Star. Those shining stars, he liked to point out, were one of those special treats for people like us who lived out in the wilderness. Rich city folks, he'd say, lived in fancy apartments, but their air was so polluted that they couldn't even see the stars. We'd have to be out our minds to want to trade places with them. Let me read that one more time. Rich city folks, he'd say, lived in fancy apartments, but their air was so polluted that they couldn't even see the stars. We'd have to be out of our minds to want to trade places with any of them. What do you think Rex is really saying with that example of words to the wiser? Because when I read the quote, the first thing that comes to mind is how much he appreciates the earth and the land and the tangible things that come without money, right? But also, he's letting the kids know how much they should appreciate those things. Because often people like myself, people like the people he's describing in his example, live in the city and they don't realize how important those things are. So he's letting Jeanette know that not only do we not need those things, those people don't really need them either. And we would be crazy to want to trade places with them because they have these materialistic items. But ladies and gentlemen, what might Rex really be covering up if he's really just saying all of this because he lost his job and he's not able to provide the presents? What might he really be trying to say? I can't afford things, so this is what we have? One could think that. But you could also just go with the fact that Rex appreciates the environment. Let's keep reading. Pick out your favorite star, Dad said that night. He told me I could have it for keeps. He said it was my Christmas present. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to pause here. I need you to go ahead and read from the rest of page 40, read 41, read 42, read 43, and meet me on the bottom of page 44. And we'll jump back into this text together. Pick out your favorite star, Dad said that night. He told me I could have it for keeps. He said that it was my Christmas present. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us to pause here. You're going to go ahead and read the next 1, 2, 3, 4 pages for me. Read the rest of 40, and you're going to read all the way to the bottom of 44. While you are reading, ladies and gentlemen, I need you to do 2 things. You're going to, 1, find another example of words to the wiser in the text. Once you find it, tell me who said it. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the second thing you'll do is tell me what this person means with their example of words to the wiser. So again, look for an example of words to the wiser over the next 4 pages that you read. Tell me what it means. And we'll jump back into the text on page 45. Alrighty. Hopefully you found a couple of great examples of words to the wiser. If you weren't able to, you probably should reread your pages because I know that there are some in there. But let's jump back into the text. Meet me on the top of page 45. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. Looks to me like you got in a fight, Dad said. He was sitting on the table, taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. Just a little dust up, I said. That was the word Dad always used after he'd been in a fight. How many were there? 6, I lied. Is that split lip okay? He asked. This little old scratch? I asked. You should have seen what I did to them. That's what everybody says, huh? That's my girl, Dad said, and went back to the clock. But Brian kept looking over at me. The next day, when I got into the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair that fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. Just back off now, and everyone can walk away with all of their limbs still attached, Brian said. It was another one of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls stared at him before bursting into laughter. They surrounded him. Brian did fairly well fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared beneath the flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and hit one of the girls on the head with it. From the jolt in my arm, I thought I'd cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me to the ground and kicked me in the face. Then they all ran off, the girl I had hit holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple of spots seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but then that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain link fence and he discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves, and we eventually settled down to a feast, burying our faces in the huge wet hands of the lettuce and eating until our stomachs ached. I guess we scared them off pretty good, I said to Brian. I guess, he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud that he had taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. Lettuce war, Brian shouted. He tossed half an eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up the heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved as it made a pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane, and a fine white powder came sprinkling down our heads. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to tell me what was the words of the wiser in that example, in that section that we just read. I can give you a hint. It's right around where they get into that fight, and Brian is the one offering it. So I'm going to tell you. When Brian says, just back off now, and everyone can walk away with all of their limbs attached, he's really saying, I'm giving you an opportunity before I have to get crazy in here. What is this showing about his relationship with Jeanette? And how close does this demonstrate that they are? So let's jump ahead of the text a bit. I won't be mad at you for skipping the last couple of paragraphs on those pages. Meet me on the top of page 48. We have just a few more pages to get through. So again, ladies and gentlemen, think about the words to the wiser that we've already identified. Think about what they have shown to you about these characters, and keep those in mind as we read through these next few pages. A few months after Maureen was born, a squad car tried to pull us over because the brake lights on the green caboose weren't working. Dad took off. He said that if the cops stopped us, they'd find out that we had no registration or insurance and that the license plate had been taken off of another car, and they'd arrest us all. I'm sure no one wants to go into that situation, huh? After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn. With us kids fleeing, he made a screeching U-turn. After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn, with us kids feeling like the car was going to turn over on its side. But the squad car made one too. Dad peeled through Blythe at 100 miles an hour, ran a red light, cut the wrong way up a one-way street, the other cars honking and pulling over, and he made a few more turns, then headed down an alley and found an empty garage to hide in. We heard the sound of a siren a couple of blocks away, and then it faded. Dad said that since the Gestapo would have their eyes out for the green caboose, we'd have to leave in the garage and walk home. The next day, he'd announced that Blythe had become a little too hot and we were hitting the road again. This time, he knew that we were going. A few months after Maureen was born, a squad car tried to pull us over because the brake lights on the green caboose weren't working. Dad took off. He said that if the cops stopped us, they'd find out that we had no registration or insurance and that the license plate had been taken off of another car, and they'd arrest us all. After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn, with us kids feeling like the car was going to tumble over on its side, but the squad car made one too. Dad peeled through Blythe at 100 miles an hour, ran a red light, cut up a wrong way street, the other cars honking and pulling over. He made a few more turns, then headed down an alley and found an empty garage to hide in. We heard the sound of the siren a couple of blocks away, and then it faded. Dad said since the Gestapo would have their eyes out for the green caboose, we'd have to leave it in the garage and walk home. The next day, he'd announced that Blythe had become a little too hot and we were hitting the road again. This time, he knew where we were going. All right, folks, I'll stop there. I want you to finish reading the rest of page 48. Go ahead and read up until page 50, which is literally just this page, the next page, and a little section on page 50. Answer the last couple of questions I have for you and be ready to move on tomorrow. Great job today, ladies and gentlemen, because I know you're going to do one.